The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. I remember because I had just finished folding laundry, Robert's old flannel shirts that I still couldn't bring myself to give away, and the phone was sitting on the kitchen counter, buzzing against the tile like it had something urgent to say. The light through the window was that flat grey you get in Knoxville in late October, when the sky can't decide whether it's overcast or clear. The yard had gone still in that quiet way it does before the temperature drops. I picked up without checking the name. I already knew it was Daniel. He had a habit of calling at that particular hour late enough that I'd be home, early enough that I wouldn't yet be busy with dinner. When I'd be, as he once put it, more receptive. He didn't open with hello. He opened with, "Mom, I need to talk to you about the seating arrangement." So I sat down, not because I was alarmed. I sat down because I had learned, over 30 years of raising that boy, that when Daniel said he needed to talk about something practical, a seating arrangement, a budget line, a schedule, what he actually meant was that a decision had already been made, and he was calling to inform me of it. The conversation wasn't an invitation. It was a notification. He explained that Cassandra's family had a lot of people coming in from out of state. The venue had a firm capacity. They had done their best with the numbers. Really, they had, and he hoped I understood. I asked him very quietly what exactly he was telling me. He said, "There wasn't a seat for me at the ceremony. I want you to understand the specific weight of that. Not the reception, not the dinner, the ceremony itself. The wedding of my only son, the boy I had raised largely on my own, after his father Robert passed, and there was no chair with my name on it." He said it gently. "The way you tell someone their parking spot has been reassigned." He said I could watch the live stream. I remember the refrigerator humming in the background. I remember noticing it, because everything else in the kitchen had gone very quiet. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not say a single thing I would later regret. What I said was, "I understand, Daniel. Let me think about a few things on my end, and I'll be in touch." He seemed relieved. I could hear it in the small exhale that followed. He probably took my calm for agreement, filed the conversation under resolved, and moved on with his afternoon. Some people mistake silence for permission. I set the phone down on the counter, next to the laundry, next to one of Robert's flannel shirts, the blue one with the frayed left cuff. He had worn every Saturday morning for the last decade of his life, and I stood there in the quiet kitchen for a long moment. I didn't reach for anger. I never do. What I reached for was clarity. The wedding was 11 weeks away. Daniel knew I had been funding it. He knew because I had written every check. The venue deposit, the catering hold, the florist, the photographer, the rehearsal dinner at the inn on the river. All of it paid for, or committed to, from the account Robert and I had kept together since 1991. The account I maintained after he was gone, because it felt like a form of continuity, like keeping a door open to something that mattered. What Daniel did not know what he had, perhaps never thought to ask, was whose name was on every single one of those contracts. Mine. I had written my name on every signature line because I was the one writing the checks. I was the one who met with the vendors, sat across from coordinators, went through each page of paperwork. Daniel had come to one venue meeting, left early, and trusted me to handle the rest. He had trusted me to handle it. I went to the small desk in the back bedroom, Robert's old study, and opened the file drawer. I pulled out the venue contract and turned to the first page. I read my name at the top, printed clearly in neat handwriting. I set it on the desk. Then I pulled out the florist contract, the photographers, the inns. Every page said the same thing. Party responsible for payment, Margaret Elaine Holloway. That was my name. I stacked the contracts neatly, placed a binder clip across them, and sat down in Robert's old chair. I remember sitting very still for a while, thinking about what a person does when she realizes the ground beneath her is different from the ground she thought she was standing on. I thought about procedure. Robert used to say that was what made me good at my job. 31 years in the Knoxville public school system, the last 12 as director of student services. He said, I saw systems the way other people saw furniture. Just there, just part of the room. Useful if you understood how to move them. I made a cup of tea and stood at the kitchen window as the yard went dark in the early evening. And I let myself think carefully, without rushing about what kind of lesson a mother owes her son. Not a cruel one, but a real one, the kind that stays. Later that evening, I found myself thinking about who Daniel had been before Cassandra entered his life, and who he had gradually become after. Because none of what happened makes sense without that. He was a good boy. I mean that plainly, without sentimentality. He was the kind of child who noticed things. When Robert got sick the first time, Daniel was 15. He didn't ask what he could do. He didn't wait to be told. He simply started waking up early on Saturdays to make coffee before I came downstairs. I would walk into the kitchen in my robe, and he would already be at the table doing homework, and the coffee would be there. We never talked about it. It was just a thing he did. A quiet kindness. The kind that doesn't ask to be seen. That version of my son I still carry with me. The drift was gradual. That's the part people often don't understand. It wasn't one argument, one moment. It was more like a tide going out. Slow and steady, until one day you look down and realize you're standing on wet sand, wondering where the water went. The first moment I remember clearly was Thanksgiving, 3 years before the phone call. Daniel had brought Cassandra home for the first time. We were in the kitchen, Robert's kitchen, which I had kept exactly as he left it. The cast iron pan on the left hook, the ceramic canisters lined up by height, the small print above the stove that hung slightly crooked but had always been his. So I left it that way. Cassandra looked around and said, pleasantly, "This is so retro. I love it." She meant it as a compliment. I believe she did. But what I noticed wasn't the words. It was the way Daniel looked at her after she said it. Not at me, at her. Checking her reaction, the way you check a compass when you're not sure of your direction. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Later, I realized that moment mattered more than I understood. The second moment came when Daniel called to tell me they were engaged. I told him I was happy for him, and I was. Then I told him what Robert and I had always planned, that we would help with the wedding. There was a pause. Then Daniel said, "That's great, Mom. Cassandra is going to be so relieved." Not thank you, not that means a lot. Cassandra is going to be relieved. I was standing in the backyard when he said that. The dogwood Robert planted along the fence was just starting to bloom small white flowers against the grey wood. I remember thinking, he doesn't know, he just said something unkind. That was the part that stayed with me. Not the unkindness. The fact that he didn't even hear it. The third moment was quieter. About 6 months before the phone call, Daniel came by alone and we sat on the back porch. Late summer, warm evening. He told me Cassandra's family had strong opinions about the wedding. Her mother wanted certain things. Her grandmother had expectations. He described it like weather, something inevitable. I let him finish, and then I asked him what he wanted. He looked at me for a moment, then looked past me into the yard and said, "I just want everyone to get along." I heard what he meant. He wanted me to make myself smaller. He didn't say it that way. He would have been upset if I had said it out loud. But I heard it. That night I went to Robert's study and looked at the wedding folder. Contracts, receipts, vendor emails, months of careful planning. I looked at it for a long time before opening it. Then I emailed Patricia Odom, my attorney since Robert's estate, and asked for a meeting. At the time, I wasn't planning anything dramatic. I was gathering information. That's what I've always done when something important needed deciding. The phone call 10 days later changed the information I was working with. It made something clear that had previously just been a feeling I hadn't named yet. Daniel had decided I was a resource, a quiet one, a reliable one who could be counted on to absorb whatever was needed without requiring the inconvenience of a chair. So I called Patricia the next morning. I told her the facts, the venue, the contracts, the phone call, the live stream. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "Maggie, who signed those vendor contracts?" I told her. "And the payments, what account?" I told her that too. There was a short pause. Then she said something I have thought about many times since. She said, "Then you're not a guest at this wedding, Maggie. You're the client." And that was the moment everything became very clear. Patricia and I met 2 days later, on a Thursday morning, at her office on Gay Street in downtown Knoxville. It's an older building with tall windows that let in that same flat, grey, fall light, the kind that makes everything look serious and deliberate. I had been there many times over the years for Robert's estate, for refinancing the house, for the small legal questions that accumulate over a long life, lived carefully. It had always felt like a place where things got settled, not dramatically, just properly. I brought the folder. Patricia went through it the way she goes through, everything methodically, without expression, reading each page fully before turning to the next. She has a quality I have always respected in professionals. She does not perform reaction. She simply processes. When she finished, she folded her hands on top of the folder and said, "Every contract names you as the responsible party. Every payment originates from your account. Daniel's name doesn't appear on a single binding document." I said I knew that. She said, "Do you know what that means in practical terms?" I told her I had some understanding, but I wanted to hear it from her. She explained that as the named client on each vendor contract, I held the legal relationship with every vendor involved. I could modify the agreements. I could cancel them, subject to the cancellation terms. I could redirect deposits where the terms allowed. Daniel and Cassandra, as a couple, had no contractual standing with any of these vendors independent of me. Without my name, there was no enforceable agreement. Without my account, there was no money. She paused and then said, very calmly, "The question isn't what you're able to do, Maggie. The question is what you want to do and why." That was the right question. I told her I didn't want to destroy anything. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't sitting there trying to burn something down just because I had the means. What I felt wasn't rage. It was something quieter than that. It was clarity. I told her I wanted to withdraw my financial participation from the wedding in a way that was legally clean and gave every vendor proper notice. Not punitive, not chaotic, just factual. A change of plans executed by the person who had the standing to execute it. And then I told her the second thing. I told her I wanted to establish a scholarship fund. In Robert's name, in both our names, at Whitmore High School, where I had worked for over 3 decades for students who would be the first in their families to apply to college. The money that had been set aside for the wedding, everything not already spent, would go there instead. Somewhere that would grow. Somewhere that would carry our names into rooms we would never enter and futures we would never see. Patricia looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Let's start making calls." The first call was to the venue. The coordinator, Lena Marsh, knew my voice before I finished introducing myself. Every email, every floor plan revision, every conversation about linens and seating had gone through me. I told her I needed to discuss a significant change to the booking. She asked me to come in that afternoon. The venue was a restored farmhouse, about 20 minutes outside the city. The kind of place that photographs beautifully and books up years in advance. I had chosen it because Daniel had once mentioned, years earlier, that he liked old buildings with character. He hadn't said it in the context of weddings, just in passing. But I remembered. Lena met me in the front office. Late afternoon light came through the window at a low angle, catching dust in the air. She was professional in the way people in event coordination learn to be calm, composed, ready for anything. I placed the contract on the table and told her I was the named client on the agreement and that I needed to cancel the booking for personal reasons. She glanced at the contract, then back at me and said, "You're the booking client and you're requesting cancellation?" I said yes. She asked if the couple was aware of the conversation. I told her I was the party with whom she had a contractual relationship, and the decision was mine to make. I said it without heat, just the way you read a clause from a document. She reviewed the cancellation terms and explained them clearly. The initial deposit was non-refundable. A later payment would be partially returned. She said she would have the exact calculation by the end of the day. I thanked her and asked her to note in the file that the cancellation was initiated by the client of record and that there was no fault on the part of the venue. She typed it exactly as I said it. Then she said, "I'm sorry, things didn't work out." She meant it politely, professionally, without needing details. I appreciated that more than she knew. I sat in the car afterward and wrote in my notebook, "Venue cancellation confirmed. Partial refund pending." Then I drove to the florist. Diane had done Robert's funeral arrangements years earlier, and she had been kind in a way I never forgot. When I walked into her shop, she hugged me before I said anything about why I was there. The shop smelled like fresh stems and cool water and something green and alive. I told her I needed to cancel the wedding order. She looked at me for a moment and said, "You sure, Maggie?" I said I was sure. She said, "Okay." Just that. No questions I didn't want to answer. No judgment. We went through the order, what was refundable, what had already been committed. 15 minutes, maybe 20. Then she made coffee, and we stood there talking about ordinary things. The weather, the road construction on the north side, a garden show she thought I might like. It was ordinary, quietly, deliberately ordinary. And I was more grateful for that than I could easily explain. That was when something inside me settled, not dramatically, just quietly. Like a room after the windows have been closed against the wind. I drove home with the notebook in my bag and the folder on the passenger seat, and I found myself thinking about Robert, about the scholarship, about students who would one day open a letter with our names on it and not know anything about the circumstances that made it possible. I thought, that is where this money was always supposed to go. We just didn't know it yet. I had 2 more vendors to contact the caterer and the inn, and I had not yet called Daniel. That call I was in no hurry to make. Not out of avoidance, out of order. I wanted every vendor conversation finished before I spoke to him. Finish one thing before you start the next. That had always been my way. I called the caterer Friday morning. He was professional, polite, walked me through the cancellation terms, told me what would be partially forfeited and what would be returned. I noted everything in the notebook. Then I called the inn where the rehearsal dinner had been booked. That deposit would be returned in full. 4 vendors, 4 calls, all completed within 48 hours of my meeting with Patricia, all handled cleanly, documented carefully, without a single raised voice. The financial lane was nearly closed. The social lane was about to open. Daniel called Saturday morning while I was in the backyard, pulling the last of the summer plants from the beds. It was cold enough for a jacket. The dogwood was bare, just the grey structure of it against the sky. I answered and he said, "Mom, I just got a call from the venue." I said, "I thought you might." There was a long pause. Then he said, "What did you do?" I noticed he didn't say hello. I noticed he didn't ask what happened. He asked what I did. I told him I had cancelled the venue, and the catering, and the florist, and the rehearsal dinner. The silence that followed was heavy, not empty. Pressurized. Then he said, "You can't do that." I said, very calmly, "Daniel, every contract was in my name. Every payment came from my account. I am the client of record with every vendor. I can, and I have." He said, This is insane. The wedding is in 11 weeks. I said I was aware of that. He started to say, Cassandra is going to, and then he stopped himself. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, less sharp, more uncertain. Mom, why would you do this? I had thought carefully about that answer. I said, You called me 10 days ago to tell me there was no seat for me at your wedding. You delivered that information like a scheduling update. I have been funding this wedding, coordinating it, signing every contract, and I was told I could watch it on a screen. I decided that if there is no place for me at the wedding, then there is no place for my money in it either. He said, quietly, That's not fair. I almost smiled, not unkindly. Just because it told me exactly where we were beneath all the adult language, somewhere very young. I said, I'm not trying to hurt you, but I need you to understand what I did with that money. And then I told him about the scholarship. I told him about the fund in Robert's name, in both our names, for first-generation college students. I told him it would open in January. He was very quiet after that. Then he said, Dad would have wanted to be at my wedding. That one landed. I won't pretend it didn't. I stood in the cold backyard and let the weight of that sit where it needed to sit. Then I said, Your father would have wanted a seat at your wedding too, and he would have wanted you to offer one to me. I told him I loved him. I told him to call me when he was ready to talk without anger between us. Then I put the phone back in my pocket and went back to pulling roots from the garden bed, the slow, ordinary work of preparing something for winter so that it might come back in the spring. By Sunday, the social side of things had begun to move, the way news always moves in families quickly, unevenly, gathering interpretation as it travels. My sister Roberta called from Nashville. She had already heard some version of the story. Roberta has always loved me without hesitation, but she processes things out loud and at considerable volume. She arrived in the conversation already halfway through her reaction. Maggie, people are saying you cancelled the whole wedding. I told her I had cancelled my financial participation in the wedding. The wedding itself was Daniel and Cassandra's to manage as they saw fit. She said, There's a difference? I said, There's an enormous difference. She went quiet for a moment, which for Roberta is notable. Then she asked, more gently, Did he really tell you there was no seat? I said yes. There was a pause. Then she said, Lord, Maggie, not in judgment, not in anger. In the tired tenderness of a sister who has watched you carry things quietly for a long time and has occasionally wished you would set something down hard enough for people to hear it. I told her I was fine. And I was. More settled than I had felt in months. Then I told her about the scholarship, about Robert's name on the fund, about the students who would apply and never know the circumstances that made it possible. She went quiet again, and when she spoke, her voice had softened. Robert would have loved that. I said, I know. By Monday, the caterer had sent the cancellation figures. Patricia reviewed them and confirmed everything was in order. The partial refund from the venue had already been processed. The inn's deposit was returned. The florist's numbers had cleared the previous Friday. The financial side of it all was closing cleanly, entry by entry, the way well-kept records close, not with noise, but with confirmation numbers and settled balances and the quiet satisfaction of a ledger that says exactly what it means. What I did not know yet was that Cassandra's mother had called the venue trying to reverse the cancellation. The coordinator told her the cancellation had been processed by the client of record and the file was closed. I learned this later from Patricia, who had received a call from a Nashville attorney representing Cassandra's family. He wanted to discuss the matter of the cancelled arrangements. Patricia listened for a few minutes and then explained, very calmly, that I was the sole client on all vendor contracts, that all cancellations had been executed within the terms of those contracts, and that there was no legal basis for the inquiry. After she hung up, she called me and said, Maggie, they're going to make some noise. I said, I expected that. She asked if I was worried. I thought about the contracts in the folder, the confirmation numbers in the notebook, every step taken carefully and properly. I said, "Authority doesn't come from saying something loudly. It comes from whose name is on the document." She laughed, a short, genuine laugh. "I'm going to remember that one," she said. A week later, a formal letter arrived from the attorney. It was 2 pages of dense legal language suggesting that my cancellation had caused harm and financial disruption, and that there had been an expectation I would continue funding the wedding. I read the letter slowly at the kitchen table with my coffee. The garbage truck moved down the street outside, stopping at each house, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary morning. The letter was trying very hard to sound like an emergency. The morning was not cooperating. Patricia drafted a response. 2 paragraphs. The first established that I was the sole client on all contracts and had exercised my cancellation rights in full compliance with the agreements. The second stated that no written or legal obligation had ever been made requiring me to fund the wedding. The final line read, "We consider this matter closed." 5 words. I have always admired Patricia's instinct for the closing sentence. After that, the legal noise faded the way Patricia said it would, like weather passing through. Loud when it arrives, then gone. What surprised me most was how little space it took up in my life. I slept well. I kept my routines. I went to water aerobics on Wednesday morning like I always did. I had lunch with my former colleague Denise at the Thai place on Cumberland Avenue, like we had done every other week for years. I didn't tell Denise everything. I told her enough. That Daniel and I were going through a difficult stretch. That I had made some decisions not everyone was happy about. That I felt clear about them. She studied me for a moment and then said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I'm actually the clearest I've felt in a year." She nodded slowly and said, "Then whatever you did was probably right." She didn't ask for details. That was one of the things I always appreciated about Denise. She understood the difference between wanting to be known and wanting to be explained. A few days later, Daniel called again. This call was different from the first one. The sharpness was gone. The defensiveness was gone. What was left sounded younger somehow, more honest. He said, "Mom, can we talk? Actually talk?" I said, "Yes." He told me Cassandra's family had looked into their legal options and had been advised there wasn't anything they could do. Then he said, quietly, "I know you knew that." I didn't say anything. I let the silence sit there for a moment. Then he said, "I shouldn't have called you about the seating the way I did. I treated it like a logistics problem, like you were someone I needed to update, not someone I needed to think about." I said, "Yes, that's what it felt like." He was quiet again, then said, "I think I've been trying so hard to keep everyone happy that somewhere along the way I stopped paying attention to what I was doing." I said, "I'm not asking you to choose anyone over anyone else, Daniel. I never was. I'm asking you to remember who I am to you and who your father was. And what it means to carry that forward with some care," he said, very quietly. "I know, Mom. I believed that he meant it. Not perfectly. Not all at once. But I believed he had started to see something he hadn't been willing to see before. I told him the scholarship fund was moving forward regardless of anything else. I told him it would carry Robert's name, and mine. He asked what it would be called. I told him, "The Robert and Margaret Holloway First Generation Scholarship." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Dad would have liked that." I said, "I know. We talked for a while after that, not about the wedding, not about the contracts. We talked about Robert, about a fishing trip when Daniel was 12, when Robert caught a fish so small. Daniel laughed until he couldn't stand up straight. Daniel laughed, remembering it. A real laugh. I realized I hadn't heard that laugh in a long time. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a while and thought about what it means to leave something behind that grows after you're gone. Something that carries your name quietly into rooms you will never see. I thought it was probably the most Robert thing I had ever done. November came in quietly that year. The trees finished turning and then finished falling, and the neighborhood settled into that particular stillness that comes before the holidays begin pulling at everything. Daniel and Cassandra had their wedding, a smaller venue, fewer people. By all accounts, it was a good day. My sister sent me a photograph afterward. Daniel and Cassandra caught mid-laugh, unposed, the way the best photographs are. I was glad, truly glad. I had never wanted the wedding to fail. That was never the point. Some lessons are shaped like walls. You don't understand they're there until you walk into them. And sometimes the most loving thing a person can do is stop moving the furniture. On the day of the wedding, I raked the yard. I made soup from one of Robert's mother's recipes. I ate at the kitchen table with a book beside me. I went to bed at a reasonable hour. I did not watch the live stream. The following week, the director of the Whitmore High Foundation called to tell me the scholarship announcement had gone out, and counselors were already identifying students who would apply. I wrote it in the notebook. Scholarship applications open January, because I wanted a record of it. A clean entry among all the others that said something different from cancellation figures and attorney letters. That said, this is what it was for. A few weeks later, Daniel came to the house on a Sunday afternoon. He brought a bottle of wine Robert used to like. That told me something before he even said a word. We sat in the living room, where the photographs are. Robert, at different ages. Daniel growing up. The three of us at the lake, at Christmas, at the Cumberland Gap with that impossibly small fish. Daniel looked at that photograph for a long time before he sat down. Then he said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about carrying things forward with dignity." I said I was glad. He said, "I think I let myself get pulled into a way of doing things that wasn't really mine, and I didn't notice it happening until it already had." I listened. I didn't interrupt. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Mom, for the phone call, for the way I handled all of it." I said, "I know you are." I told him I hadn't done what I did to punish him. I did it because there are things his father and I built together that deserve to be treated with care. Our history, our work, our family, including him. And I wasn't willing to watch those things be taken for granted in silence anymore. We ate soup and talked about Robert, about ordinary things, the kind of Sunday that doesn't announce itself as important, but is. When he was leaving, he stood at the door and asked, "Are we okay, Mom?" I thought about the past 6 weeks, the contracts, the phone calls, the letters, the scholarship, the garden, the photograph on the wall. And I said, "We're getting there, Daniel. That's enough for now." He hugged me before he left. A real hug, not rushed. That night I washed the wine glasses, put the leftovers in the refrigerator on Robert's shelf, second shelf, left side, and sat for a while in Robert's study. Everything was in its place. I have thought a lot since then about what those weeks taught me. Not just about Daniel, about myself. Silence is not agreement. Patience is not permission. And the quiet, careful tending of something real, a life, a memory, a legacy, is not a small thing. It is everything. If stories about quiet dignity and the grace of a boundary held without cruelty mean something to you, you are welcome to stay. There are more of them. And they are all, in their own way, about the same thing. Knowing what is yours, tending it carefully, and letting it speak for itself.